Shard by Linda Sue Park, illustrated by Julie Kim. Korea is an ancient country located on a peninsula on the eastern edge of Asia. In the 1100s, Korea was a kingdom of farmers and nobles. However, it also had potters, people who made beautiful vases and other objects from clay. The potters were considered to be artists. Trier, the hero of this selection, has only one wish: to become a potter and make works of art from clay. Trier was so called after the mushroom that grew in wrinkled half circles on dead or fallen tree trunks, emerging from the rotten wood without benefit of parent seed. A good name for an orphan, Crane Man said. If ever Trier had had another name, he no longer remembered it, nor the family that might have named him so. Tree-Ear shared the space under the bridge with Crane Man, or rather, Crane Man shared it with him. After all, Crane Man had been there first, and would not be leaving any time soon. The shriveled and twisted calf and foot he had been born with made sure of that. Tree-Ear knew the story of his friend's name. When they saw my leg at birth, it was thought I would not survive, Crane Man had said. Then as I went through life on one leg, it was said that I was like a crane. But besides standing on one leg, cranes are also a symbol of long life. True enough, Crane Man added. He had outlived all his family, and unable to work, had been forced to sell his possessions one by one, including, at last, the roof over his head. Thus it was that he had come to live under the bridge. Once, a year or so earlier, Tree-Ear had asked him how long he had lived there. Crane Man shook his head. He no longer remembered. But then he brightened and hobbled over to one side of the bridge, beckoning Tree-Ear to join him. I do not remember how long I have been here, he said, but I know how long you have. And he pointed upward, to the underside of the bridge. I wonder that I have not shown you this before. On one of the slats was a series of deep scratches, as if made with a pointed stone. Tree-Ear examined them, then shook his head at Crane Man. So? One mark for each spring since you came here, Crane Man explained. I kept count of your years, for I thought the time would come when you would like to know how old you are. Tree-Ear looked again, this time with keen interest. There was a mark for each finger of both hands, 10 marks in all. Crane Man answered before Tree-Ear asked. No, you have more than 10 years, he said. When you first came and I began making those marks, you were in perhaps your second year, already on 2 legs and able to talk. Tree-Ear nodded. He knew the rest of the story already. Crane Man had learned but little from the man who had brought Tree-Ear to the bridge. The man had been paid by a kindly monk in the city of Songdo to bring Tree-Ear to the little seaside village of Chualpo. Tree-Ear's parents had died of fever, and the monk knew of an uncle in Chualpo. When the travelers arrived, the man discovered that the uncle no longer lived there, the house having been abandoned long before. He took Tree-Ear to the temple on the mountainside, but the monks had been unable to take the boy in because fever raged there as well. The villagers told the man to take the child to the bridge, where Crane Man would care for him until the temple was free of sickness. And, Crane Man always said, when a monk came to fetch you a few months later, you would not leave. You clung to my good leg like a monkey to a tree, not crying, but not letting go either. The monk went away, you stayed. When Tree-Ear was younger, he had asked for the story often, as if hearing it over and over again might reveal something more. What his father's trade had been, what his mother had looked like, where his uncle had gone. But there was never anything more. It no longer mattered. If there was more to having a home than Crane Man and the bridge, Tree Ear had neither knowledge nor need of it. Breakfast that morning was a feast. A bit of the rice boiled to a gruel in a cast-off earthenware pot, served up in a bowl carved from a gourd. And Crane Man produced yet another surprise to add to the meal: two chicken leg bones. No flesh remained on the arid bones, but the two friends cracked them open and worried away every scrap of marrow from inside. Afterward, Tree Ear washed in the river and fetched a gourd of water for Crane Man, who never went into the river if he could help it. He hated getting his feet wet. Then Tree Ear set about tidying up the area under the bridge. He took care to keep the place neat, for he disliked having to clear a space to sleep at the tired end of the day. Housekeeping complete, Tree Ear left his companion and set off back up the road. This time he did not zigzag between rubbish heaps, but strode purposefully toward a small house set apart from the others at a curve in the road. Tree Ear slowed as he neared the mud and wood structure. He tilted his head, listening, and grinned when the droning syllables of a song chant reached his ears. The master potter, Min, was singing, which meant that it was a throwing day. Min's house backed onto the beginnings of the foothills and their brushy growth, which gave way to pine-wooded mountains beyond. Tree Ear swung wide of the house. Under the deep eaves at the back, Min kept his potter's wheel. He was there now, his gray head bent over the wheel, chanting his wordless song. Tree Ear made his way cautiously to his favorite spot, behind a paulownia tree whose low branches kept him hidden from view. He peeped through the leaves and caught his breath in delight. Min was just beginning a new pot. Min threw a mass of clay the size of a cabbage onto the center of the wheel. He picked it up and threw it again, threw it several times. After one last throw, he sat down and stared at the clay for a moment. Using his foot to spin the base of the wheel, he placed dampened hands on the sluggardly lump, and for the 100th time, Tree Ear watched the miracle. In only a few moments, the clay rose and fell, grew taller, then rounded down, until it curved into perfect symmetry. The spinning slowed. The chant, too, died out and became a mutter of words that Tree Ear could not hear. Min sat up straight. He crossed his arms and leaned back a little, as if to see the vase from a distance. Turning the wheel slowly with his knee, he inspected the graceful shape for invisible faults. Then, pah! He shook his head, and in a single motion of disgust, scooped up the clay and slapped it back onto the wheel, whereupon it collapsed into an oafish lump again, as if ashamed. Tree Ear opened his mouth to let out his breath silently, only then realizing that he had been keeping it back. To his eyes, the vase had been perfect, its width half its height, its curves like those of a flower petal. Why, he wondered, had Min found it unworthy? What had he seen that so displeased him? Min never failed to reject his first attempt. Then he would repeat the whole process. This day, Tree Ear was able to watch the clay rise and fall 4 times before Min was satisfied. Each of the 4 efforts had looked identical to Tree Ear, but something about the 4th pleased Min. He took a length of twine and slipped it deftly under the vase to release it from the wheel, then placed the vase carefully on a tray to dry. As Tree Ear crept away, he counted the days on his fingers. He knew the potter's routine well. It would be many days before another throwing day. The village of Chuolpo faced the sea, its back to the mountains and the river edging it like a neat seam. Its potters produced the delicate celadon ware that had achieved fame not only in Korea, but as far away as the court of the Chinese emperor. Joalpo had become an important village for ceramics by virtue of both its location and its soil. On the shore of the Western Sea, it had access both to the easiest sea route northward and to plentiful trade with China, and the clay from the village pits contained exactly the right amount of iron to produce the exquisite gray-green color of celadon so prized by collectors. Trier knew every potter in the village, but until recently he had known them only for their rubbish heaps. It was hard for him to believe that he had never taken the time to watch them at work before. In recent years, the pottery from the village kilns had gained great favor among those wealthy enough to buy pieces as gifts for both the royal court and the Buddhist temples, and the potters had achieved new levels of prosperity. The pickings from their rubbish heaps had become richer in consequence, and for the first time, Trier was able to forget about his stomach for a few hours each day. During those hours, it was Min he chose to watch most closely. The other potters kept their wheels in small windowless shacks, but in the warm months, Min preferred to work beneath the eaves behind his house, open to the breeze and the view of the mountains. Working without walls meant Min possessed great skill and confidence to match it. Potters guarded their secrets jealously. A new shape for a teapot, a new inscribed design. These were things that the potters refused to reveal until a piece was ready to show to a buyer. Min did not seem to care about such secrecy. It was as if he were saying, "Go ahead, watch me. No matter. You will not be able to imitate my skill." It was true, and it was also the main reason that Trier loved watching Min. His work was the finest in the region, perhaps even in the whole country. Trier peered between the leaves of the Paulonia tree, puzzled. Several days had passed since his last visit to Min's house, and he had calculated that it was time for another throwing day. But there was no sign of Min at his work, nor any wet clay on the wheel. The workshop area was tidy, with a few chickens in the yard, the only signs of life. Emboldened by the silence, Trier emerged from his hiding place and approached the house. Against the wall was a set of shelves, holding a few of Min's latest creations. They were at the stage the potters called leather hard, dried by the air, but not yet glazed or fired. Unglazed, the work was of little interest to thieves. The finished pieces were surely locked up somewhere in the house. Trier paused at the edge of the brush and listened hard one last time. A hen clucked proudly, and Trier grinned. Min would have an egg for his supper. But there was still no sign of the potter, so Trier tiptoed the last few steps to stand before the shelves. For the first time, he was seeing Min's work at close range. There was a duck that would have fit in the palm of his hand with a tiny hole in its bill. Trier had seen such a duck in use before. A painter had been sitting on the riverbank, working on a water scene. The painter had poured water from the duck's bill onto a stone, a single drop at a time, mixing ink to exactly the correct consistency for his work. Trier stared at Min's duck, though it was now a dull gray, so detailed were its features that he found himself half listening for the sound of a quack. Min had shaped and then carved the clay to form curve of wing and tilt of head. Even the little tail curved up with an impudence that made Trier smile. He tore his gaze away from the duck to examine the next piece, a tall jug with ribbed lines that imitated the shape of a melon. The lines were perfectly symmetrical, curving so gracefully from top to bottom that Trier longed to run his finger along the smooth, shallow grooves. The melon's stem and leaves were clearly shaped to form the lid of the jug. The last piece on the shelf was the least interesting, a rectangular lidded box as large as his two hands. It was completely undecorated. disappointed in its plainness. Tree Ear was ready to turn away when a thought struck him. Outside, the box was plain, but perhaps inside. Holding his breath, he reached out, gently lifted the lid, and looked inside. He grinned in double delight at his own correct guess and at Min's skill. The plain box held 5 smaller boxes, a small round one in the center, and 4 curved boxes that fit around it perfectly. The small boxes appeared to completely fill the larger container, but Min had left exactly the right amount of space to allow any of them to be lifted out. Tree Ear put the lid of the large box down on the shelf and picked up one of the curved containers. On the underside of its lid was a lip of clay that held the lid in place. Tree Ear's eyes flickered back and forth between the small pieces in his hand and the larger container, his brow furrowed in thought. How did Min fit them together so perfectly? Perhaps he made the large box, then a second one to fit inside, and cut the smaller boxes from that. Or did he make an inside box first and fit the larger box around it? Maybe he began with the small central box, then the curved ones, then... Someone shouted. The chicken squawked noisily, and Tree Ear dropped what he was holding. He stood there paralyzed for a moment. It was the old potter. "Thief!" he screamed. "How dare you come here? How dare you touch my work?" Tree Ear did the only thing he could think of. He dropped to his knees and cowered in a deep formal bow. "Please, please, honorable sir, I was not stealing your work. I came only to admire it." The potter stood over the boy. "Have you been here before, beggar boy?" Tree Ear's thoughts scrambled about as he tried to think what to answer. The truth seemed easiest. "Yes, honorable sir. I come often to watch you work." "Ah." Tree Ear was still doubled over in his bow, but he allowed himself a single sigh of relief. "So is it you who breaks the twigs and bruises the leaves of the Paulina tree just beyond?" Tree Ear nodded, feeling his face flush. He had thought he was covering his tracks well. "Not to steal, you say? How do I know you do not watch just to see when I have made something of extra value?" Now Tree Ear raised his head and looked at Min. He kept his voice respectful, but his words were proud. "I would not steal. Stealing and begging make a man no better than a dog." The potter stared at the boy for a long moment. At last Min seemed to make up his mind about something, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost the sharpest edge of its anger. "So you are not stealing. It is the same thing to me. With one part damaged, the rest is of no use." He gestured at the misshapen pottery box on the ground, badly dented from its fall. "Get on your way, then. I know better than to ask for payment for what you have ruined." Tree Ear stood slowly, shame hot in his breast. It was true. He could never hope to pay Min for the damaged box. Min picked it up and tossed it on the rubbish heap at the side of the yard. He continued to mutter crossly, "Aye, 3 days' work, and for what? For nothing. I am behind now. The order will be late." Tree Ear had taken a few dragging steps out of the yard, but on hearing the old potter's mutterings, he lifted his head and turned back toward him. "Honorable potter, sir, could I not work for you as payment? Perhaps my help could save you some time." Min shook his head impatiently. "What could you do, an untrained child? I have no time to teach you. You would be more trouble than help." Tree Ear stepped forward eagerly. "You would not need to teach me so much as you think, sir. I have been watching you for many months now. I know how you mix the clay and turn the wheel. I have watched you make many things." The potter waved one hand to cut off the boy's words and spoke with derision. "Turn the wheel. Ha! He thinks he can sit and make a pot, just like that. Tree Ear crossed his arms stubbornly and did not look away. Min picked up the rest of the box set and tossed it too on the rubbish heap. He muttered under his breath so Tree Ear could not hear the words. Min straightened up and glanced around, first at his shelf, then at the wheel, and finally at Tree Ear. Yes, all right, he said, his voice still rough with annoyance. Come tomorrow at daybreak, then. 3 days it took me to make that box, so you will give me 9 days' work in return. I cannot even begin to think how much greater the value of my work is than yours, but we will settle on this for a start. Tree Ear bowed in agreement. He walked around the side of the house, then flew off down the road. He could hardly wait to tell Crane Man. For the first time in his life, he would have real work to do.